Let's get peppy. It's time for Peppisode 75. Once again, from the studio directly after a record, I am Chaz Licciardello and this is Dr. David Smith. Hey,
That's
David.
right.
Yep.
I can't promise a stable internet connection today.
Oh, is this a different internet connection to last week?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll see how we go. I'll be ready to vamp if we need be. Now, like I said, this is straight after record, so I can tell you things that we're not going to talk about in this podcast because I spoke about them at length on the show, which you can see on YouTube or Facebook. We're not going to be talking about the January 6th Commission. We're not going to be talking about CDC's new guidance. We're not going to be talking about Afghanistan or 2020's record drug overdose numbers. If you're interested in any of those four topics, after this podcast, listen to the podcast first. It's more important. After this podcast, go and watch the show and you can hear what we have to say about that. But first of all, a couple of updates, Dr. Dave, before I get into the new stuff. An update on police reform. We've talked about that on and off for the last 2 years. It appears to be a dead parrot. When we left police reform, Tim Scott was negotiating a qualified immunity deal, and this was the big sticking point between the two sides. The Democrats wanted to get rid of qualified immunity completely. Qualified immunity is when it's a court concept, a legal concept that when there isn't a precedent already of a cop being successfully sued for some kind of conduct, he or she is regarded as immune from being sued for that particular conduct. Obviously, it's hard to create precedents when people are unsuccessful unless there is already a precedent. And that's the problem with qualified immunity. Democrats want to get rid of it. Republicans not so much. Tim Scott was negotiating a deal where individual police couldn't be sued if qualified immunity applied, but police departments could be sued if qualified immunity applied. So the individual police officers would not be sued, but the departments would, and that would in itself cost the departments a lot of money, and it would provide incentive for police to not do dodgy things. It would give them incentives to not be horrible. Now, the Fraternal Order of Police did support that deal, but two other cop lobbies did not. The National Sheriff's Association and the National Association of Police Organisations turned against it, and so the Republicans are now turned against it as well. In fact, some Republicans want qualified immunity now to be codified into statute, not just to be a legal concept. And Lindsey Graham has proposed a middle ground where they let departments be sued, but only for cases involving death and serious bodily injury, which it's not a bad negotiation tactic, I guess. I mean, it's better than nothing. It wouldn't help punish, say, the cops who threw explosives into a 78-year-old man's home during a SWAT raid on the wrong house, for example, or the cops who got qualified immunity after stealing $225,000 during a search warrant, say, but it would be an improvement. But bottom line is, I don't think it's going to happen, which is a shame.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's going to happen either. There was a moment last year when, there wasn't really a moment last year when this was ever going to happen.
No, it wasn't.
I mean, yeah, we can see too clearly how the politics of this were going to play out, even if there are some Republicans who think that some of these things would be a good idea. It's a bit different from criminal justice reform. And I would posit that one of the reasons why is that when we think about criminal justice reform, we think of the villains of the piece as the legal system, courts, and prisons to some extent. And these are all things that people have sort of bad associations with them, especially, conservatives around judges and courts and prosecutors to some extent. But the problem is, when you get into the police, that's something that has very positive associations for conservatives and Republicans. So anything that could be framed as an attack on police will be framed as an attack on police. And so the politics of this were always going to be impossible. There's more that can be done at the level of criminal justice reform, but police reform was always probably going to be a bridge too far.
And in fact, even the people who are not fans of the police, you see this in poll after poll, still recognise the job that they do. Like you see polls where people say, "I've been discriminated against the police. I'm scared of the police," but at the same time, they don't want the police numbers reduced. So it's a tough area to reform.
Yes.
Yeah. Another update, just quickly, Hunter Biden. Recall when we left this story, Hunter Biden was not at all dodgily selling his doodlings for up to $500,000 each. And he decided he was an artist. But the White House promised that no one would know who was actually buying those $500,000 paintings except the art dealer. They said, so no corruption was even possible, they said, because these people will be completely anonymous. Okay, now, came out the end of last week that Hunter Biden will actually be wandering around the gallery meeting potential buyers for his art directly beforehand. So he's going to know exactly who's in that gallery. I'll let Jen Psaki take it from here because the press sort of woke up to this one. This is what she said. She said there's nothing to see here, and this is why.
He's not going to have any conversations related to the selling of art. That will be left to the gallerist, as was outlined in the agreement that we announced just a few weeks ago. We believe this is a reasonable system that has been established that allows for Hunter Biden to work in his profession within appropriate safeguards. So he's not going to discuss anything related to the selling of art. And I would reiterate that the gallerist will be the only person who handles transactions or conversations in that vein and will reject any offer that is out of the ordinary.
Wouldn't it be more transparent to just release the names of the buyers so that everyone would know who purchased this art and how much they paid?
Well, we won't know who the buyers are. Hunter Biden won't know who the buyers are. So I think the origin, I think, of this line of questioning, which is understandable, is about whether this would provide a situation for undue influence. But we won't know who they are. So there's no scenario where they could provide influence.
Didn't they just announce on social media that they bought a painting?
Again, I think we have set up a system which we feel is appropriate, has appropriate safeguards. We believe that Hunter Biden, just like any child of a president, should be able to pursue their professions and their passions. And any selling of the art would be through the gallerist.
Are you convinced, Dave?
No. I just want to note here that there's been the art market has really changed in recent years. So there's been this explosion of volume in the art market. So in terms of the number of transactions in the art market has multiplied many times over recent years. And especially in the last year, art has become one of these things where, people have a lot of cash stockpiled that they can't spend in their usual ways. So they're looking for other things to spend it on. And art, like old trading cards and non-fungible tokens and things like this, has become one of these things that it's almost like an extension of the stock market. It's a speculative market. Art is also, it's become a central vehicle of money laundering. Yeah. So there's room for all kinds of shenanigans here. And, I can see why Biden wants to get in on that. But I think that I don't think that his works should be sold. I think that they should be put on tour with George W. Bush's works and taken around America.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, for posterity. That's fantastic. I love the idea of it. He's going to be walking around, but he's not going to talk about the artworks. He's going to talk about Ukraine. What's he going to talk about? Mind you, you want to have a drink with him.
The Bidens, of course, famous for their verbal restraint.
Yes. Anyway, look, I'm not convinced, obviously, either. That's why I played that big, long grab. And the last question was the critical question. It doesn't matter who doesn't officially know. Any of them can say at any point in time when they want a favour, I'm the guy who paid $500,000 for your son's artwork. It's not hard. Anyway, let's leave that. Let's get on to new stuff. This week is obviously all about the Olympics, but let's not do an Olympics podcast. Do you have anything to say about the Olympics at all?
Yeah. Just on the, Simone Biles controversy, which
is huge in America.
Yeah, should not be a controversy at all. I mean, she's an athlete at the top of her game, often described as the best gymnast in history.
Yeah.
Who made a decision not to continue competing because she didn't feel that she was in the right space, which if you're a gymnast and you don't feel you're in the right space, the consequences of continuing could be incredibly dangerous.
Like it's fatal. Yeah.
So really, I mean, the discourse about that this has been incredibly stupid and disheartening. But I just want to say, the world would be a much better place if more high-profile people made reasoned judgments about when it's time to stop, right? So one thing I hope can come out of this is Stephen Breyer, take the fucking hint.
That is a great call. Stephen Breyer is a Supreme Court justice who's, I think, 83 now, 82 or 83.
Yes.
And he was just interviewed just the other day by a Supreme Court journalist, they do exist, who in a coffee store in rural New Hampshire, no less, he just has people following him all through the forests of New Hampshire. And when asked if he'd decide when he was going to step down, he said no. He said his new seniority in the justices' private discussion over cases, quote, has made a difference to me. It's not a fight. It's not sarcasm. It's deliberation. He also said that he undertook a new role in internal debate, speaking sooner in the justices' private conferences, steered by the rhythms of seniority. Now, look, to be fair to Stephen Breyer, when a journalist buttonholes him in a cafe, he's got to say something, and he doesn't want to give her, even if he's thinking of retiring next year, he doesn't want to give any clues at this point in time. So he might have just been talking a bit of crap. But it doesn't sound great that he's putting that kind of stuff above the court.
Unless his seniority gives him access to radical new treatments that somehow reverse the aging process.
That's possible. That's possible.
Who cares?
That's possible. Look, yeah, we'll actually think, let's just say for it, let's take him at his word, not that. I'm going to ignore those quotes. Let's take him at his word that he's worried about politicisation of the court. And he's worried that if he steps down right now when everyone's saying, oh, you got to step down for the Democrats, it's going to look like a political move, which is what he has leaked out. Well, that's the thing.
It looks like a political move.
To me, even if he hates politicisation of the court, I can understand why he'd hate that. It just reeks of delusions of control.
Yeah.
Stephen Breyer, you have no control over whether the court seems political or not. That is something that is in the control of the entire political community, not just you, Stephen Breyer. You have no say.
Yeah, but also, I mean, judges have been timing their retirements to get replaced by someone with similar politics for years, for decades.
Yeah. Now, Stephen Breyer would say that if he does it as well, that would make it worse. But what I would say is, once again, Stephen Breyer, you have no control over whether things look good or bad politically for the court. Your only control is whether you win or lose politically in this particular case. That is your only point of control. And at the moment, he's using it to lose, assuming that the Republicans take the Senate at the end of next year.
Exactly.
And then he will definitely be replaced by a conservative judge.
Yeah, well, he won't be replaced, first of all.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, of course.
He won't be replaced until there's a Republican presidency.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
As I pointed out before, my very favourite historical fact of all time, the last time that a Republican majority Senate actually confirmed a Supreme Court nomination put forward by a Democratic president was 1895.
It's a great stat worth reiterating. I mean, the bottom line is if Stephen Breyer wants retirements to be less political, which I understand, he should support reforms to make them less political, which is easy. Term limits, 18 years. There's no politicisation if every 2 years the judge retires.
Yeah.
Simple. Now, sure, the election before will be political, but those elections are already kind of political. That's kind of the point. So anyway, that's what I would say.
Anyway, Brian, obviously we know that you're listening to this. You're a big fan of the show, we imagine, because you love stats nuggets and things like that.
Yeah, listen to us, Steve. We've got your interests at heart. I was just going to say, by the way, on the Biles thing, just quickly, one thing which hasn't been emphasised. I agree with everything you said about that. It's so typical of the way the internet works that you've got on one side people saying she let her country down, her teammates down, she's horrible, and the other side saying no, actually she's the best, she's fantastic because she pulled out, and we all think that she's wonderful. Can't we just talk about a topic without there being some kind of moral element? Just going, you know what she did was sensible. It made sense. Let's move on. I guess it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. When a gymnast clearly has no idea where the floor is, which was the case during her vault, the vault she did, you could see her eyes darting everywhere and her head was bobbling around and it was obvious that she had no idea where the floor is. That is potentially fatal. She has no option but to stop at that point in time for her own health. Simple. Now, I know that she's kind of a victim of her own PR because a quote got out. I don't know if it was from her or from a PR artist representing her or from the team. There was a quote that was attributed to her that said, "I feel like I'm also not having as much fun this Olympic Games. I want it to be for myself, but I came in and I felt like I was still doing it for other people. It hurts my heart that doing what I love has been kind of taken away from me to please other people." And people said, "Oh, she's just been a selfish Gen Zer." Like that quote, whether it's her or not, does not necessarily sum up everything she's thinking. That's just a random quote, and people just hung it around her and just said, "Oh, that's."
I agree with that. I agree with that quote anyway. But anyway, yeah. You're right. Yeah. We shouldn't be reading anything morally into this except about the partisan composition of the Supreme Court.
Yes, thank you very, very much. But by the way, just on the before we leave the Olympics, on the athletes, can I just say how sorry I feel? Let's leave Simone Biles, but just how horrible it would be to be an athlete and just have Channel 7 camped out with your family 24/7. Have you just noticed Channel 7 just live in people's houses these days? And Titmus's grandma seems to be in everyone's house. She just goes from house to house, Titmus's grandma. I don't know if she's actually a grandma, if she's just a derelict who just follows Channel 7 around, but she just shows up in everyone's house. Anyway, let's leave that aside. Let's move on to American politics. Oh yeah, Supreme Court, we brought them up. I might as well just say, just get off my chest here, there are two cases that are coming, which you need to look out for. One is the abortion case is now coming. We've been talking about this for a while. The case which will end Roe versus Wade effectively is definitely on its way. It's a Mississippi case, it's called Dobbs. It's a 15-week ban for a 15-week abortion ban in Mississippi. You might say, well, there's no reason why that should necessarily end Roe versus Wade. I mean, they might have another exception. And in fact, this case was first started in March 2020, and that was exactly what they did. They said at the time, the questions, this is a quote from their filing, "The questions presented in this petition do not require the court to overturn Roe or Casey. They merely ask the court to reconcile a conflict in its own precedents." But then in May 2021, when the Supreme Court took the case, with Amy Coney Barrett there, all of a sudden they changed their mind and they decided that this case, they changed their filing and said now this case is about whether Roe or Casey should remain as law, and we say they should not. And 38 of their 49 pages is now devoted to overturning Roe and Casey in the filing. Yeah. So this is going to be the case. Whether they go through it, whether they completely overturn it, or whether they chip away at it over a series of cases, we don't know, but it's starting.
Absolutely. But yeah, as we've talked about before, when you abolish viability as the standard, and viability is probably around 22 weeks, there's disagreement over it, but it's around that range, then you don't have any standards anymore.
Yeah.
Right. It's, 15 weeks is completely arbitrary. There is nothing, once you go to 15 weeks, to stop you from going down to, 8 weeks, 8 days, 8 seconds.
Yes, exactly.
Nothing.
And on that note, the guns case, I think, is a little bit further back, but that's coming as well. And let me tell you why. This is actually a case at a lower level. This was at the Court of Appeals level. And the case is actually overruled by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. But I read in the reasoning something that really jumped out at me, and I thought, oh, here we go, it's coming. The case was about California's assault weapons ban. A district court judge found it unconstitutional. His reasoning, this guy was, what's his name? Judge Roger T. Benitez. Okay. His reasoning was that, according to Heller, which was the sort of the more recent seminal case when it comes to the Second Amendment, that if it's a common weapon, then they don't want it to be unconstitutional. According to, you can't restrict it, according to Heller. And this guy said that this case is not about extraordinary weapons lying at the outer limits of Second Amendment protection. The banned assault weapons are not bazookas, howitzers, or machine guns. Those arms are dangerous and solely useful for military purposes. Instead, the firearms deemed assault weapons are fairly ordinary, popular modern rifles. This is an average case about average guns used in average ways for average purposes. Okay, that's not amazing. It was overruled by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a very left-wing court. He may now appeal to the Supreme Court. I think he probably will. This is the bit which I found interesting, though. In Benitez's judgment, he said this. Let me read you a quote. Before the court, there is convincing and unrebutted testimony that the versatile AR-15 type of modern rifle is a perfect firearm for a citizen to bring for militia service. A law that bans the AR-15 type rifle from militia readiness is not a reasonable fit for protecting the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms for the militia. It has been argued that citizens with nothing more than modern rifles will have no chance against an army with tanks and missiles. But someone forgot to tell Fidel Castro, who with an initial force of 20 to 80 men armed with M1 carbines walked into power in Havana in spite of Cuba's militarized forces armed with tanks, planes and a navy. Never mind the second bit. The bit I'm interested in is the way he kept on talking militias. Because remember in the Second Amendment, there's a bit where they refer to a well-regulated militia. And that usually gets ignored. Like we would just kind of just move on with that one, bit. This guy's making a point of the militia. You need an AR-15 to be part of the militia, he says, over and over again. Now, what he's doing is he's talking about the idea of the crazy militias that we know and fear and suggesting that they are an essential part of the Constitution. He's making the Second Amendment not about the guns, but about the militias. And that's a really big step. I've never heard that before. And it just got passed over. But I could so see some of the Supreme Court justices, the conservative ones, doing the same thing. And when they do that, it becomes so much harder to regulate guns in any capacity. Yeah. And that's a real worry to me. Because the evolution of Second Amendment law, first it was about hunting way back when, like in the 50s and 60s, that they were talking about hunting. Then it became about security. Now it's about militias who potentially fight the government. That's what this guy was talking about, militias fighting the government. So yeah, that to me is a really worrying area, and it may be a terrible legacy of this current Supreme Court. We'll see.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Dave, let's get into Congress. Do you have anything to say about the reconciliation bill or about the bipartisan infrastructure bill or anything like that?
No.
No, that's fine. Okay, I think we have talked about it a little bit. I will. I'll reorder because I've been talking a bit. Let's get you to talk about something. I'll come back to Congress in a second. Dave, why don't you tell us about J.D. Vance?
Yes, let's talk about J.D. Vance, who has been in the news a bit this week because he's found a way to get himself into the news, which he is talking about how childless people don't have a stake in the future. So, I mean, it's been a big policy thing of his for a while that America needs to have more children, that children are better than immigrants. It's not just about economic replacement, it's that children create more of this investment in the community. And he talked about AOC and other members of Congress not having children, suggesting they don't have a stake in the future of the country. But of course, he had to go even further than that to maximise his troll time. So he suggested that children should have votes, but their parents should control them. And then, because that wasn't obnoxious enough, he said that the country's being run by crazy cat ladies. So, okay, let's step back and have a look at what is JD Vance actually doing here. So JD Vance is running for the Senate in Ohio, and he's facing a very crowded Republican field, albeit not one that looks as intimidating as it once did, because it doesn't look like Jim Jordan is running. And if Jim Jordan, who is Ohio's most prominent Republican, Trump ally, had run, he almost certainly would have won. But he is up against a couple of hardcore Trump allies who are better known than he is in Ohio. And this is the thing about JD Vance. He's a guy with a national following that doesn't have much of a local following at all. Now, that national following, of course, comes from his 2016 book, Hillbilly Elegy. And I didn't realise until recently that the person who encouraged him to write this book was Yale Law School's Amy Chua, who was one of his mentors. I'm not going to get into Amy Chua in this, but she's been a controversial figure recently at Yale. But anyway, like every good Republican populist, JD Vance was educated at an Ivy League law or business school. Yes. And so he was encouraged to write this memoir of growing up, his time divided between Kentucky and Ohio. I was one of the many people who wasted my time by actually reading this book back in 2017. And
onto the book list, Dave?
Sorry?
Onto the book list?
No, this is not onto the book list. One of the reasons why this book was so successful was because liberals were scrambling for any explanation of Trump supporters that didn't involve overtly calling them racist, right? So, and this book provided the answer. Now, when you open this book, I mean, JD Vance, to his credit, he lays his cards on the table from the very beginning. He said, people think that in Appalachia, the problem is that poverty causes cultural pathologies. He says, no, it's the other way around. Cultural pathologies cause poverty. And he illustrates this through an anecdote of someone that he knew who was offered a great job in a warehouse but wouldn't take it because he's a piece of shit. So it's a culturalist explanation for why this part of the country is in so much poverty. It's told in the form of a memoir, which is his own story growing up, and obviously not doubting the authenticity and power of his own testimony, but he really basically generalises his own experience and his own family experience to the entire region.
Dave, I don't want to. This is a slightly geeky, not very relatable point to make, but isn't what you just said just a retread of Charles Murray?
You are absolutely right, Chaz. Yeah. Yes, it is a lot like Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart. Yeah. And like Charles Murray, JD Vance makes this move of saying, okay, I'm talking about white people here. I'm talking about white people's cultural pathologies causing them to be in poverty. Conservatives love this because that then enables them to talk about black cultural pathology and to use as evidence, oh, but look, these people, they're talking about cultural pathology for white Americans, cultural pathology is just the problem. So it's actually something that provides, I'm not accusing JD Vance or Charles, no, sorry, I won't go that far. I'm not accusing JD Vance of racism here, but one of the reasons why his book was popular was because of the fact that it allowed people who use cultural pathology in a racist way to talk about it in a non-racist way. So anyway, he got a lot of praise. New York Times said that this book was one of the 6 best books for understanding Trump. I mean, I've got to admit, I didn't finish it, but I think I did get about 90% of the way through it. But then he went into this bizarre tribute to the payday loans industry. And I'm like, oh, what the fuck have I just been reading? Fuck this shit. But anyway, okay. The point is, JD Vance's original audience was mainly self-flagellating liberals. He didn't actually have much of a conservative base at all. He instead was seen by liberals as this sort of working class white whisperer, Conservatives paid very little attention to it, right? Because, I mean, this was actually, it was, as shit as it was a proper book that he wrote. It wasn't a large print Christmas special about how liberals are ruining America. There was actually an attempt at social critique in here. Fuck, Conservatives aren't going to be interested in that, apart from the sort of most rarefied circles. So even though he was always obviously pretty nakedly political ambitious, he didn't actually have a conservative base. Now, I remember in 2016, he was clearly still trying to be seen as a bridge between liberalism and conservatism. And I remember when Trump took office in 2017, he actually wrote this op-ed that was a moral tribute to Obama. He said, I always admired Obama's personal morality, and his family was a great example. And he said, even though politically I'm happy that Trump is taking power, morally it's sad to see Obama go. Now, over the last 4 years, J.D. Vance has undergone a transformation as he tries to get a conservative foothold somewhere. And it's been very difficult for him because, he's this, at least someone who thinks of himself as really morally decent. He's Ivy League educated. He wants to be able to talk not just in the conservative bubble. So he hasn't been able, until this point, to actually bring himself to say the sort of things that make you popular in conservative circles. He doesn't like talking about conspiracy theories. He doesn't like using overtly racist and sexist language. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, yeah, I was going to say just two quick things as well that I should emphasise as well, that in 2016 he said a whole bunch of very negative things about Trump. There's about 7 or 8 tweets of his that are brought up against him every single time that he comes up against a pro-Trump person. And the second thing is he happens to be up against 2 of the biggest orange noses in America. The people he's up against are so into Trump, it's just degrading, which means he's got a lot of catching up to do. So
that's right. Yeah, so he is, and he's been looking for Trump's endorsement, but I can't see him doing stop the steal stuff. Maybe he will. Maybe he is going to realise that there's no way to win this primary without going full stop the steal, and maybe that's what he'll do. But for now, what he's desperately trying to do is to get attacked. So you can see that what he's trying to do with these attacks on childlessness is to get some smug liberal on Twitter to say, oh, this dumb hillbilly breeder, the world would be better if you didn't have children, so that he can portray himself as the conservative victor. And Twitter being Twitter, someone is going to do that. I don't know if they've done that so far, but he's already acting as if that's the case. So I googled JD Vance this morning. First thing that comes up is a Fox News clip from today. He's on Tucker Carlson talking about why the left is ramping up its attacks on me. In reality, the left is not ramping up their attacks on him. He's a pretty marginal figure compared to some of the people out there, but he's trying to insert himself into the conversation. And you know what? I'm prepared to give him a hand because he is a different kind of Republican. So that's why. I'm talking about him now. Obviously, his Give Children the Vote proposal. What I like about it is that it's so stupid. Yeah. There's something.
Sorry, you didn't say what the proposal was. We should tell these people. His proposal is that people get extra votes for their children. So if you have 3 children, you get your vote plus 3 others. So it's not just the children get a vote. You get 4 votes because you have 3 kids. That's his proposal, yes.
It's kind of so delightfully stupid that I actually want to see him take it to an election. As Philip Bump pointed out, it's structurally very similar to, landowners should get more votes. It's completely against any kind of principle of one person, one vote. Although, as we know, that is a deeply unpopular idea with Republicans at the moment anyway. But yeah, this is, he's really trying to carve out a niche. I still don't think he's got a good chance in the Republican primary. Although with Jim Jordan out of the race, it's possible he's got a better chance now. But as you say, the two people who he's up against, whose names I honestly cannot remember at the moment, one of them was the treasurer of the Ohio Republican Party.
Josh Mandel.
No, that Josh Mandel's the other one.
The other one. Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
But they're both full stop the steal, and I just don't see him being able to do better than that. Although caveat on all of this, there is evidence emerging that maybe Trump's hold on Republican primaries is not as strong as we thought, and that was the
Texas 6.
The Texas 6. So that's basically Fort Worth. Yeah, where the candidate that Trump endorsed didn't win. Now, admittedly, Trump's endorsement in this special congressional election, that's probably not something that's very salient in people's minds anyway. But yeah, I mean, they're just sort of ignoring it, which is interesting.
It is interesting. And it's also, I mean, it's to come back. I mean, I am going to come back to Congress a little later, but just to dip our toe into the infrastructure thing for a second, it's interesting that Trump has gone all guns blazing against this bipartisan infrastructure bill.
Yes.
And 17 Republicans voted to proceed. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to vote for it.
No.
But it does mean that they know that they are potentially getting Trump offside when they do it. And they did it anyway when there was no need for them to do it. Even if tactically Mitch McConnell decided, yeah, we're going to do this, they only did 10. But they got 17, which means there's a lot of people not caring, which is interesting. And, on that note, there was a poll a couple of weeks back, which I was looking to work in. I'm also working in now, from a Republican pollster, Tony Fabrizio. And in February, in a multi-candidate field, Trump led DeSantis, who was second, 51-7. And DeSantis was second with 7%. And in early July, that lead had slipped to 47-19, which is still a smashing, but that's a shift of 16 points.
Yes.
In the Trumpless poll, by the way, like when you ask Republican candidates without Trump, DeSantis had gone from 17% to 39%, and second was Pence, who'd gone from 19 to 15%. Third was Cruz, gone from 13 to 7%. But here's the interesting one. In a two-man contest, just Trump versus DeSantis, Trump was beating DeSantis 58-31. That's a lot closer than I would have expected.
That's way closer than I would have expected, yes.
Yeah. And amongst people who describe themselves as not so strong GOP, but still Republican, DeSantis was winning 40-39.
Yeah.
So that was, I found that really interesting.
It is. I mean, people might just be getting quietly sick of Trump, or just, they don't want to keep thinking about him anymore.
Yeah. I mean, of course, Trump hasn't gone...
Or they might not see him as someone who can actually win an election.
Possibly. But I was going to say also that it's not a real poll until Trump goes scorched earth on DeSantis, which he will at some point in time. Yeah,
I cannot wait until that happens.
That will be interesting because DeSantis is a smart guy. And so it will be... I mean, he's I'm not saying he's Cicero, but I'm saying that he can hold his own, and that will be interesting when they go each other. But anyway, in that same section of stuff which I wanted to bring up at some point in time, by the way, was a Change Research poll about Murkowski. Do you want to guess what their approval is amongst Alaskan Republicans these days?
No, I don't even want to guess.
6%.
Wow.
Yes. Interestingly, her approval is 48% amongst Democrats. She might as well just run as a Democrat. Anyway, while we're talking Republicans, do you have anything more to say about J.D. Vance before we move on?
No.
No? Okay. While we're talking about Republicans, I want to bring up Tucker Carlson for a moment to talk about a particular story. This was the Tucker being, inverted commas, spied upon story. Are you across that one?
Not as across it as you are. This is one of your favourites.
I'll play the grab, and then we'll talk about it.
Yesterday, we heard from a whistleblower within the U.S. government who reached out to warn us that the NSA, the National Security Agency, is monitoring our electronic communications and is planning to leak them in an attempt to take the show off the air.
Okay, all right, that's a pretty wild charge. Tucker went on to say that these people had told him information you could only know if you'd read his emails, and another time he said they actually read out bits of his emails to him and text messages and so forth, and saying, well, the NSA, they're trying to take me off air. It turned out that Tucker was trying to organise an interview with Putin, and that's what this information was about. But before you get outraged about this...
I'm not.
Well, we don't have to work too hard to keep you calm, Dave. But before any listeners get outraged about this, I need to say that this is normal, which is the reason I brought it up. You need to realise what America is like. The NSA have permission to snoop through the calls and emails of any foreigner, okay? If a foreigner is talking to an American, then they know what the American was saying to the foreigner, okay? That's number one. Now, they're supposed to keep the Americans anonymous. They're supposed to. And, but I mean, number one, of course you'd know it was about Tucker Carlson, even without his name. I mean, how many people are going to boast about their ratings or whatever he did while trying to organise an interview? It would have obviously been Tucker Carlson. But anyway, leave that aside. In reality, American people identities can be included in reporting whenever it's deemed necessary to provide, quote, proper context for the intelligence being reported. Okay, so that's a lot of times. I'll give you some numbers to give you context here. Last year, the NSA disseminated 2,648 reports that contained masked US person identities. 1,351 reports in which of them had at least one US person's identity openly included, just to begin with. Then, the 9,354 subsequent identities were unmasked from those same communications after a specific request. So if someone's not unmasked, they just request it routinely, essentially, just to get the context of the intelligence. In 2018, 16,721 people were unmasked by NSA communications. So this is so normal. This is what they do. If you don't like it, you can change the law, all right? Which I'm going to come to in a second. But for what it's worth, the NSA conducted an investigation, supposedly, and they found that Carlson's communications were not targeted nor intercepted through incidental collection, what I just described. They said Carlson was mentioned in communications between third parties. That's where the information came from, they said. Carlson, remember, said his government source explicitly read to him parts of his texts and emails. So someone's lying there, and I'm not necessarily assuming it's the NSA that are lying. And the reason for that is because, what about that bit at the end where Tucker Carlson said, they're trying to have me taken off air? What's his evidence for that? Because that makes no sense at all if you think about it. Why would conducting an interview with Putin have Tucker Carlson taken off air? Lots of people conduct interviews with Putin. That's just regular journalism. And presumably people would know that Tucker Carlson was trying to organise an interview with Putin when the interview went to air. Presumably. So none of that makes sense. And he's provided no evidence whatsoever to suggest that they were trying to leak it to have him taken off air. So to me, Tucker Carlson, with his own allegation, proves that he's full of shit. So I'm not sure I believe Tucker Carlson when he says that he was read precise bits of his emails and texts. He might be gilding the lily a bit there. I don't know. I'm not taking a side here. I'm just saying that if Tucker Carlson was unmasked, that is normal behaviour. And if you don't like it, you should stop it. I happen to not like it, which is why I took an interest in 1 week later, the House Rules Committee agreed to a House vote on an amendment to the Department of Justice funding bill to ban the government from using funds to conduct searches of Americans' digital communications without court approval. That vote's coming up in the next week or two. Let's see all the people who are whinging about Tucker Carlson, and that is every Republican, let's see how they vote on that amendment, because that amendment would stop it tomorrow. We'll see.
Yeah. Look, when that authority of the NSA comes from the Patriot Act. When the Patriot Act was written and also renewed, back in those days, Tucker Carlson was a bow tie wearing twerp on CNN who loved George W. Bush and loved getting a rise out of Paul Begala, and wanted to send the Dixie Chicks to Guantanamo Bay or whatever. So you reap what you sow, Tucker. You're eating your own bow tie at the moment.
Although I don't think I can't read his mind. I'm not sure he's crying, to be honest. It gives him something to rail on about and get populist about without doing anything. That's kind of his MO.
He's another excellent example of a prep school populist. I'm not sure if he went to an Ivy League school or not, but
I don't think he did. I don't think he qualified. And, anyway, on this kind of stuff as well, another thing which I've been pointing out for a while,
yes,
the Texas Democrats, they've just been sucking up all this media time, and we haven't mentioned them once. I just want to say a couple of quick things about them, and then see. Actually, you go first if you want to. Do you want to go first? Do you have any views about them? No. Okay, I'll go first. They're still hanging out in Washington. They're pissed off that Biden isn't meeting with them, which I find a bit funny. They've spread so much COVID now that they're no longer telling us how many of them have it. They stopped at 6. At that point in time, they said, we're not doing any more updates about the number of people who have COVID. Look, I don't have a problem with them skipping. It's a filibuster. It's essentially a filibuster. I have no problems with them skipping town to avoid quorums. I mean, I don't like filibusters. I don't think there should be any filibusters, but I don't think you should be surprised when politicians take advantage of the rules that exist as they currently exist. And so, I don't really have a big problem with it. Republicans do the same thing in Oregon, in blue states. All I would say is that the thing that they're objecting to is kind of bullshit. Like, there were objectionable parts of the Texas Voting Rights Bill originally. There were some very objectionable parts. They had a provision to shut down a bunch of urban voting centres. Mm-hmm. They had a provision to cut down Sunday voting, which basically is directly targeting black people who go to church. Essentially, both of those were clearly racially based proposed reforms. Yeah. So that was dodgy. But they removed both of them after the last time the Democrats, they hid in the church last time and to avoid the vote. And it worked. It worked. They removed those sections. So now what are they protesting about? What they're protesting about is a provision that makes it easier for observers to be annoying and to interfere. Now, I don't think that's a good provision. I think it's a bad provision. I think that's a piece of shit law that they're proposing there. But I don't think it's Jim Crow laws. I think it's more just irritating. And it's one of those two can play at that game kind of laws, where it just degrades democracy generally. Like, I don't think it's necessarily a Republican or Democrat thing. It's just a shit thing. And it's definitely not something that you need to hide in Washington for 8 weeks to avoid. Let's put it that way. Like, I don't think that's going to change the result of the election in Texas. I think much more of a concern in Texas is the laws that already exist, because they have some terrible election laws. And I'll give you a classic example of that. Right now, there's a guy called Harvest Rogers. Have you heard about this guy? He was, I've forgotten what he was in jail for. It was something pretty bad. It was one of those 15-year sentences. And he had probation. He was 1 month short of probation when he voted in the primary, a Democrat primary. And he was lining up for 5 hours to vote in that primary. So he got in the news as the last guy to vote. And someone saw that. And he mentioned that he was just come out of jail as part of that segment. And so they charged him for that, because you're not supposed to vote if you're an ex-felon until you have finished your probation. He didn't know that. Understandably, he was in the community. He was just part of the community. Yeah. And he didn't realise that you're not supposed to vote if you're on probation. He was a month short of his probation being over. He has been charged and he's facing 40 years in jail and $100,000 bail. That's the law in Texas. That's what's shit. And that's what exists. So to me, the Democrats hiding because of this observers thing, I don't know what they're doing, but to me, it just seems like a bit of a joke. What are your thoughts?
I have nothing to add to this
Okay.
at all. Apart from to say, I've been into the Texas State House in Austin. Just to refresh Pep listeners on this, I'm fairly sure that we've talked about this before. The Texas legislature only meets once every 2 years. Yeah. And its sessions don't last particularly long either. I'm not quite sure how long it is. And I mean, like a lot of state legislatures in the US, it's not very professionalized. And in case you're wondering about this whole sort of how is it that they're fleeing the states, what's this about? It's because the legislative sessions are so short that this is actually an effective technique. If you just run away, a session can expire. And what's happened is they've been brought back
For a special session, yeah.
or this special session to deal with the stuff that they, that they fled from last time. So just to give the Peppers a little bit of background on this, but I do not have anything to add to your assessments, Chaz.
That is fair enough. By the way, I just been hoeing into the Texas Democrats a bit. The Republicans are pretty bad as well. There was a very funny quote in terms of dodginess. Because there's a few Texas Republicans trying to push an audit of the 2020 results at the moment, even though Trump won convincingly. Anyway, but they just want the audit in the big Democratic counties, right?
Yeah.
Now, what's their justification for that? Steve Toth, who's a Texas Republican there, said he did say he'd support a statewide effort if it occurred, but he argued that the undertaking would be too expensive and time-consuming. When asked if he'd consider including some smaller counties as well, he replied, "What's the point? I mean, all the small counties are red." He's just blatantly just saying it out loud.
I do like the blatancy of it, yeah.
Anyway, okay.
That gets the J.D. Vance Award for blatancy.
It does.
Stats
Stats
Nugget.
Nugget. Woo! Okay. Demographic issues, Dave. Between 2018 and 2020, life expectancy in America dropped 1.9 years, which is more than 8 times the average decrease amongst 16 other industrial nations. Life expectancy for white Americans fell by 1.4 years. The drop for black Americans was over 3.2 years. Hispanic Americans experienced a decrease of nearly 3.9 years, and that's the sharpest drop seen since World War II. Now, that's at one end, but it doesn't end there, because at the other end, they're having a crunch as well, which is a lack of births. Early estimates...
Oh, J.D. Vance territory!
Yes, well, I hope you're listening, JD. Early estimates show that US population growth for the year ended July 1, 2020, so most of that is pre-pandemic, was the lowest ever documented. It only grew 0.35%, and growth is expected to flatline completely this next year. That's obviously pandemic related. In 2020, there were only 1.07 births for every death. In 1954, it was 2.75. In half of all states last year, more people died than were born, up from 5 states in 2019. So it's an interesting little area they're in at the moment, America.
It is.
They're not the only ones. Korea is a bit like that as well, though they're not having the same
Do
number
you
of
think
deaths.
they could be enticed to have more children by the extra votes?
Sounds like J.D. Vance is a visionary to me, Dave.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the new ambassador for Australia? The potential new ambassador for Australia?
Well, yes. Now, this is very interesting because this was announced by CNN last week that Caroline Kennedy would be the new ambassador to Australia. Now, this pick makes a lot of sense because Caroline Kennedy was Barack Obama's ambassador to Japan from 2013 to 2017. Biden is trying to establish foreign policy continuity between himself and Obama especially in this area. He sees Australia as key in the region, so it would make a lot of sense, this appointment of Caroline Kennedy. Now, of course, ambassadorial appointments in the US, especially to sort of plum positions like Australia is, if only by virtue of its location, if not by virtue of the, it's sure, it's not the most powerful ambassadorial post, but it's a nice one. Yes, they're always political. And so Caroline Kennedy is a political ally of Biden's. She is the daughter of John F. Kennedy, which sort of immediately gives her a bit of political sway in the Democratic Party, which she's been exercising all her life. During the primaries, when Biden's victory was far from assured, she wrote an op-ed in the Boston Globe in praise of Biden. So, she is a fairly important political ally. But you know what worries me, Chas?
What's that?
About all of this. And it's not her, right? Because, various US watchers I know in Australia are thrilled about the idea of Caroline Kennedy, not only because they think she did a great job in Japan, but also because she has Biden's ear. Now, what I'm worried about,
You're
Chas,
worried that Hunter Biden should be the ambassador?
No, it's not even that. It's that we're still going off a CNN report here. The White House has not confirmed this. And the Washington Post did provide some backing to it, but it's still basically a CNN report. Now, why am I worried about that? Because in 2016, CNN reported on the fact that Slovenia was building a wall on the border of Australia. Last week, the White House, not CNN, the White House announced that it was appointing Victoria Kennedy as ambassador to Austria. So is this just another instance of CNN getting mixed up between Australia and Austria and getting its Kennedys confused? I will not be able to sleep until the White House actually confirms this nomination.
That's a really good pickup. It seems like getting mixed up with Austria is our lot, unfortunately.
Yeah. Victoria Kennedy, if you're wondering, is the widow of Ted Kennedy.
Right, okay. All right, so she's at least a Kennedy. She's not like Jamie Kennedy. She's not like some random person called Kennedy.
No.
No, okay, right. Well, fair enough. Okay.
Thank you for indulging me.
It's a pleasure. It was a good pickup. I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm happy to indulge that. I'm going to go back to Congress quickly, and then we'll go to COVID.
Okay, keep talking. I'm just going to get a cup of tea. I'm listening.
All right,
yes.
No problems. Okay. All right. I mentioned the Supreme Court before. There was another Supreme Court case recently, actually, which showed Brett Kavanaugh being a feminist, which is an interesting one, about whether women should be allowed to be included in the draft. And the Supreme Court actually didn't say anything. And the reason they didn't is because the federal government, so the Biden administration said, well, hang on, please don't rule on this, because we're about to say something about this and it might make the whole case moot. And they said, fine, we'll give you a little bit of time. And they have now weighed in on it, not the Biden administration, but the Senate. They've passed an amendment to the NDAA, which is the defence funding bill, including a requirement for women to register for the draft. That got through. So assuming that someone doesn't kill it in the General Senate, and I'm not sure they will, women might be included in the draft. And it's surprising that for a lot of people, I think that America still has a draft.
Well, okay, yes, I was going to say, okay, so for peppers who are a little bit confused about this, so the draft was actually abolished in 1973 by Richard Nixon with the introduction of what became known as the all-volunteer force. And I'll come back to what one of the long-run implications of that was in a second. But however, they did keep in place the mechanism by which the draft could be reinstated. And that is registration. So registration for the draft has never been abolished. But at the moment, if you're registering for the draft, it's highly unlikely you will ever be drafted because the draft doesn't exist. But this is the mechanism that allows the draft to exist. Now, Nixon abolishing the draft in 1973 was understandably quite popular with anti-war people, right? Because, when you've got the draft, not only are you fighting immoral wars overseas, you're forcing people to join in that fight. So, understandably very popular with anti-war people, also very popular with libertarians, the all-volunteer force, because, libertarians often see the draft as a form of slavery. But one of the long-term ramifications of this was that it further removed the consequences of decisions to go to war from the experience of ordinary Americans. In the Vietnam War, most Americans knew someone who had gone. If people from all kinds of communities went to Vietnam, the costs of the Vietnam War on the United States were unavoidable. They were unavoidably visible. People had a real understanding of what they were, even if they didn't understand the even bigger costs that were being imposed on the people of Vietnam. But the problem is, and Andrew Bacevich writes a lot about this in his books, and his book, The New American Militarism from 2003, still holds up. I think I might have already put that one on the list, is that basically more and more the Americans who fight wars come from very specific areas. Low-income communities, immigrant communities. I mean, it has to be acknowledged that the area that J.D. Vance comes from it's one of those areas that for generations has been producing American soldiers, and just the number of areas that actually produce American, and J.D. Vance was one of them. He served in Iraq. But the number of those areas that produce American soldiers has shrunk dramatically. So you get more and more soldiers coming out of a narrower and narrower strata of society, which means that for the rest of the United States, they actually don't come into contact, or they come into far less contact with people who have actually gone and fought wars. And one of the potential problems of this is it can increase support for wars because people are just not going to have to personally deal with the consequences of wars, which are financed by debt, fought by people that they don't know. And so I still view the abolition of the draft as a good and fundamentally important thing. But there certainly is an argument that what this has done is it's made militarism as an ideology easier because people don't actually have to come to terms with it.
I think that's definitely true about the skin in the game theory. All I would say is that there's positive results of this as well, which is, like you said, increasingly over time, it is a thinner and thinner slice of society that are volunteering their sons and daughters to join the military. But for those people, it's the best job they can have, assuming they don't get killed. In terms of pay, in terms of education, in terms of if we talk about reducing inequality, the fact that the army sucks up so many people who are from poor and disadvantaged backgrounds and gives them an excellent income and a full education for free. And it might sound ridiculous what I'm saying, but just it is actually an opportunity.
And only a slight risk of dying in a foreign country, getting blown to bits.
Yeah. Look, I did just brush past that bit. But, let's face it. The majority of people who join the army are not going to be seeing a lot of combat, despite America being stretched around the place. They're going to be sitting in an aircraft carrier off the coast of Somalia or some shit like that.
These days that's true, but for the majority of this century, it was not.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm talking about now rather than in 1974, say. But absolutely. But anyway, but that's something that's going on in Congress. I'll be interested to see that vote. Another thing that's going on in Congress is Klobuchar. Everyone's trying to end Section 230. That's the clause of that's a clause which allows the internet essentially a website is not responsible for what other people say on that website.
That's right, yeah.
They're responsible for what they put on, but if they host comments or if they host other people's input and other people say something illegal, the website is not held responsible for that. That's what Section 230 does. Republicans want to use it as as a blackmailing chip to stop, inverted commas, censorship from social media sites. Democrats want to get rid of it so they can hold websites responsible for quote misinformation. They're sort of attacking it from different ends, but they both want to get rid of Section 230. Now, Klobuchar is introducing a bill that would make an exception for Section 230, as in allow social media sites to be sued, when a social media platform's algorithm promotes health misinformation related to an existing public health emergency. Now, that's a mouthful, so let me just break that down. Firstly, it needs to be a declared public emergency to apply, okay, by the HHS. So COVID is an example. There aren't a lot of other ones. They're only talking about health misinformation there. They can say whatever they like, otherwise it's health misinformation. That's under this law. It needs to be promoted by the company's own algorithm. If it's, say, Twitter, and they're just putting up all the tweets that come up in order, no problems. Or Facebook, and it just comes up in order, no problems. If their algorithm says, oh, this is a popular one, I'm going to put this at the top of your feed, then they've got a problem. So it's when they actively promote health misinformation from an existing public health emergency. And they can only be sued for that specific health misinformation. So this is a very, very specific piece of legislation. Having said that, it's a very, very specific, stupid piece of legislation because it's precisely that kind of misinformation we're talking about that would be covered by the First Amendment. So yes, the government is saying you can be sued for it, and the courts will find that lawsuit unconstitutional when it eventuates. So it's kind of pointless, but I just want to flag it because this is going to be debated over the next few days. So,
Okay.
So you need to know not to worry about that.
Looking forward to it.
But this is part of a broader movement, and it's going to happen eventually, I think, where both the left and the right are coming up with different ways to try and limit Section 230. They're both, when both of them agree on something, it happens eventually. So I'm sure this is going to happen at some point in time, and I'm equally sure that we'll all be the worse off for it. Mr. Libertarian, what a surprise, I think that. I'm just going to say a couple of quick things about the reconciliation bill. Last week, I speculated that the bill would cost a lot more if they were being honest with their funding.
Yes.
The Committee for Responsible Budget, who are kind of wowzers, but they can do maths, they ran the same line a couple of days after, probably because they're fans of Pep, let's face it.
Of course.
And their modelling...
Everything can be explained by the fact that everyone listens to Pep.
Everyone. Their modelling said they reckon it's going to cost about $5.5 trillion if you remove all the budget chicanery. So
Right.
that's what we're looking at. Now, I want to just briefly discuss what is going on with that bipartisan bill getting 17 votes to proceed. Let me emphasise, it's to proceed. The bill has not gotten 17 votes from Republicans. The bill does not exist. But the fact that they're proceeding got 17 votes from Republicans. That should happen every time, of course, but it never happens, and it happened this time. So what is going on? Because that defies all cynicism that I have, and that I'm sure you have as well, Dave. So so this is my speculation, and I'll be interested to know what your thoughts are. I've got a couple of options. I'm not sure which one's right. Number one, remember that these guys have conversations that we don't know about behind closed doors. So it's entirely possible.
You know who does know about it?
Who's that?
The NSA.
Sorry?
The NSA.
That's true. That's true. And Tucker Carlson, because the NSA and Tucker have been talking about it. Maybe Joe Manchin has had a few conversations with some Republicans and let them know that that's his red line for when.
And they said yes, just so that he would stop talking and they could end the conversation.
That is very likely. That's highly likely. Slightly less likely was maybe that's his red line for getting rid of the filibuster. And he let them know that behind closed doors, and they said, okay, we'll let this one go. It's possible that they, once again, because of conversations behind closed doors, that they're almost certain that Manchin and Sinema are going to double-cross Dems on the reconciliation bill. And so they think they can afford to give them this the bipartisan infrastructure bill, knowing that Democrats will explode if they don't get that reconciliation bill with it. Mm-hmm. That's possible. Maybe it makes no sense for Republicans to go obstruction on this, obstructionist on this because they know that Schumer has the means to work around obstruction with the reconciliation bill. They know if they say no to the bipartisan bill, Schumer can just load all that into the reconciliation bill and just pass it anyway, and then they'll get no credit for the goodies. And so they just thought, well, why fight this? We're going to lose.
Yeah.
So they only fight. It would be a smart tactic from Mitch McConnell to only fight when he knows he's going to win.
Yeah.
And so he just goes, well, we're not going to fight that because we're going to lose
Well,
it.
and I think the fact that we are seeing it's not just the bare minimum of Republican senators that would be required, it's 17 of them.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, we'll see how many vote for the actual bill.
Yeah.
But yes, but it is interesting.
I think there is some that includes some individual senators who are pretty eager to take credit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any other theories, or do you think it's one of them?
No. I think that sounds just about right to me. I mean, also bearing in mind, infrastructure is a pretty popular thing.
It is.
As long as it's hard infrastructure.
The other thing I want to talk about with this is in the reconciliation bill, which is the partisan bill with a $3.5 trillion bill we're talking about, that's going to be attached to this. There is a bit of a sleeper issue which hasn't gotten much coverage yet. It's going to become
sleeper issue.
Yeah, it's going to become bigger, and that is amnesty. Joe Manchin has said that he supports giving Dreamers citizenship in the reconciliation bill.
Good.
Yeah. Biden is also a fan of that.
Mm-hmm.
They're also talking about including farm workers and essential workers in that as well. I don't think Joe Manchin approves of that, but they're talking about maybe try and fold them in as well. We'll see about that. But the question is, let's say they just do Dreamers. It looks like they've got the numbers for that. If they just do Dreamers, can that even go into reconciliation under the Byrd Rule? Remember the Byrd Rules, all these restrictions on what can go in a reconciliation bill and what can't.
Yes.
Normally we say, we just focus on the fact that it's got to have budgetary impact, right? That's normally what we focus on. And arguably this would have budgetary impact because of taxes. These people then pay taxes and these people can have options open to them as citizens, which and there'll be budgetary impacts there. But there is something that is a little bit more fine print. In theory, it shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be allowed in reconciliation because the rule says that it needs to be of budgetary significance in the same committee that its main effects are observed in, which is very fine printy. But the Judiciary Committee is
You're a fine print man.
I
Chad.
am. The Judiciary Committee is where the effects are observed, citizenship. The Finance Committee is where the budgetary impacts are seen, tax revenues and welfare. So they're different committees. So theoretically, it shouldn't apply. But Democrats say that it can apply because there's a precedent. When there's a precedent, they follow the precedent. And in 2005, they passed a law by reconciliation with some immigration procedures in it. But it wasn't a precedent. This is so minute. Anyway, it wasn't a precedent because no one objected to it. It doesn't become a precedent until someone objects to it, and then they assess it and decide that they're voting that it applies, that it comes under the rule. They didn't do that. So since no one objected, it's not strictly speaking a precedent. Anyway, these are the things that a parliamentarian is going to need to consider, who is an ex-immigration lawyer, I might add. So this is right down her alley. I'm betting she's going to say no, but we'll see. But if she says yes, Lindsey Graham, wait for it, inspired by the Texas Democrats, is saying they'll deny quorum in protest. You need 51 senators for quorum in the Senate. There are 50 Democrats. So he would need literally every single Republican to boycott the Senate for that to happen. He's not going to get every Republican, but it'll be interesting to see him try. Anyway, so that's something to look forward to. We'll see what happens there. Dave, before you go like 2 minutes before you go, and as always, I'll keep on going. Talk to me about what you wanted to say. I know you wanted to say something about COVID and hesitant people.
Yeah. So last week there was a much remarked shift in rhetoric on the right. So we had Sean Hannity saying, I believe in the science, I believe in the vaccine, get vaccinated. We had Mitch McConnell saying, I had polio, get vaccinated. Did he actually have polio? Or
he did.
Yeah.
Vaccines are a big deal for Mitch McConnell. He's actually paying for pro-vax ads in Kentucky at the moment?
Wow.
out of his own election fund. Anyway, go
Yes.
on. Yeah.
Okay, good. I couldn't remember whether I got that right or not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, he had polio. Now it does have to be said, both McConnell and Hannity have actually been consistently pro-vaccine, but they're being a lot more vocal about it. So this isn't they haven't had a road to Damascus moment. They're just being a lot more vocal about it now. There have actually been changes of heart from people who were previously skeptical of vaccines. Steve Scalise from Louisiana is a second highest ranking Republican in the House. He very publicly got a Pfizer shot. You know, he hadn't been prepared to do this, but he'd been prepared to publicly have a flu shot, but not a, but not a COVID shot. And there have been some other figures on Fox News who've changed their tune. So this has sent people scrambling for theories about what the reason for this shift is. Theories about, did the word come down from Murdoch? That Fox News had to change its line. Fox News vehemently denies that there's any new line being imposed on its commentators. Is it that the Republicans are getting worried that COVID will start disproportionately killing their own voters, especially older people who are higher propensity voters? I'm not sure. Like, there's not really a lot of evidence on which to determine why the shift has happened. I also want to point out it might not be as much of a shift as it looks like, because you still have people like Tucker Carlson promoting a lot of skepticism about it. You still have Trump refusing to, be very openly pro-vaccine. I think we talked last week about his line is that people don't trust the vaccine because they don't trust the government, because they don't trust the election. What I'm saying is the jury is still out on whether this is a really significant shift. If it is a significant shift, though, I actually think it's broader than something political. I think it actually is a response to things getting really bad, because there actually has been a bit of a spike in vaccinations over I think that, there was 500,000 in one day. I think it's broader than, if there is a shift, it's broader than just a shift on the right. I think it's a more general shift towards vaccination, which, if it's true, is a very good thing. It does suggest that people are responsive to changes in environmental factors. Possibly Delta is making people reevaluate.
That's what I think it is. I think it's Delta's getting through.
I think that, even somebody who previously would have thought, well, look, the risks of vaccination are worse than the risks of the disease, when they start hearing, Delta is so much more, 7 times more, I don't know what the number is, way more infectious, far more likely to put you in hospital. Possibly that has actually prompted a sort of reasonable reevaluation. So I think if there is a shift on the right, it's not just on the right. I think it's a more general kind of shift, which is a good thing.
I agree. I agree it's a good thing. And I do think that there is a certain fear of Delta is starting to seep through. And I think that that's what's going on personally. Okay, you need to go. I know
I
that.
do need to go.
So you say bye to people, and I'll keep on going with COVID.
See you next week, Peppers.
There you
Bye.
go. That's the man. See you, Dave. Dave has less time to do the podcast at this time of the day. We're doing this. Usually we do the podcast at 6 p.m. after I've done the full edit of our TV show. But while we're in lockdown and we don't have access to 2SER, we've just been doing this in the studio straight after records. And Dave teaches via Zoom, but he teaches at 2:30. So he needs to go at 2:30, unfortunately. And I'll just go until they boot me out of the studio. I am going to just tell you guys what I got here about COVID. Actually, there's a stats nugget here, isn't there? Let me look here. Yeah, it's an interesting one. No, actually, I'll save a stats nugget for Dave next week. Sorry, there's a teaser. Great stats nugget coming up next week. I'm going to talk about COVID now. So first of all, Dave talked about numbers. He got numbers slightly wrong, but it was off the top of his head. The vaccinations are actually they've been basically flatlining at 500,000 a day for the last month or so. They've actually started to nudge up to 650,000, 700,000 a day. So that's positive. It needs to go higher though. We still haven't hit the 70% target of adults that Biden was going for July 4 with a single dose. We're at like 69.3 or 69.4%, almost there, but haven't quite got there yet. Anyway, the numbers are now up to 92,000 cases yesterday, or 92,000 new cases. So that's getting up there again, and it's gone up. It's basically doubled in the last week. So that's a bit of a worry. The deaths are starting to go up too now as well. I just said on the show that the average was still in the 250 range, but then after we finished recording, I saw today's numbers. There were 400 deaths. So the deaths are starting to go up as well. We'll see if that's consistently going up or not. But yeah, it's the Delta's an issue. And Florida hospitalizations, I mentioned this on the show, they have 9,000 hospitalizations at the moment, Florida. The entire country has 24,000. So Florida is in real trouble at the moment. Something else that's, although I mentioned this on the show as well, I'm going to tell you guys, in case you don't watch the show, the Delta wave has been a very short wave in a lot of countries. In particular, I showed graphs on the show of UK and the Netherlands. The Delta wave only lasted 3 weeks. It was a huge spike and then just went straight back down again. Even in India, which had no vaccinations, the wave was like 2.5 months long, which you'd expect to go much longer than that when there were no vaccinations, and India's a big country. But the spikes are short-lived, so we'll see if it happens with America. If the same thing happens to America that happened in the UK and Netherlands, we'd expect it to start going down, in a week or two. So we'll see. What is interesting though is that I'm not going to talk about the CDC guidance, but I just wanted to say one thing about that because I mentioned on the show. One part of their guidance was they recommended that vaccinated people get tested when exposed to suspected or confirmed COVID cases, even if they're asymptomatic. Now, you might say, well, who cares? Well, until now, they've been saying the opposite. Until now, they've been saying if you're asymptomatic and you've been exposed to someone who has COVID and you've been vaccinated, don't get tested. Which means that we've had no idea of the number of vaccinated people who have cases, because most of the people who have cases would presumably be asymptomatic if they've got a vaccine, and they're not getting tested. So we have no idea how many of them there are. We're now going to find out if people follow this guidance. So that will be interesting. We'll have a better idea of, for all we know, heaps of people who have been vaccinated are getting COVID, just not getting sick. We'll be maybe about to find out if that's the case. So look out for that. A couple of quick studies. I'm not going to go into detail of these because I'm just racing through. Pfizer, Merck, and there's a Japanese company, I think it's called Shionogi, I think. They're racing to have the first COVID pill. And when I say COVID pill, I don't mean vaccine, I mean cure. If you get COVID, you take a pill every day or twice a day, you get better. Pfizer reckons their pill is likely to be on the market this year. So that's interesting. Another study, people are on, there's a nasal spray which is seeming to be effective as something that kills COVID. It's betadine. Don't start squirting betadine up your nose because betadine has other things apart from the active ingredient. But it's the active ingredient from betadine. Apparently kills COVID when there's a nasal spray form. So that may well be on the market soon as well. Something to look forward to. Interesting study about misinformation. We've heard a lot about Facebook and misinformation. Essentially, this study suggests that Facebook is worse for misinformation than Fox. Let me tell you the numbers. About 31% of people in this study got their COVID news at least partially from Facebook. About 16% of them got their COVID news only from Facebook. Out of those partial people, 61% said they'd been vaccinated compared to 64% of those who partially got their COVID info from Fox, and 68% of the general community. 76% who partially got the information from CNN were vaccinated. But wait for this. out of those who only got their news from Facebook, 47% of them been vaccinated, compared to 59% who only got their news from Fox. 73% who only got their news from CNN, and 42% who only got their news from Newsmax, which is a completely anti-vax network, Newsmax. 42% of them have been vaccinated compared to 47% from those who only got news from Facebook. So they're not good numbers from Facebook. I'm not suggesting that, I'm not jumping on the censorship board bandwagon here, but there is a problem on Facebook. Another study that was interesting, Pfizer's trying to pinch a third dose at the moment. They're trying to get the FDA to approve of them getting a third dose for people who got their second dose a long time ago. There's two studies behind this. One, there was an Israeli study that suggested Pfizer effectiveness drops from 95% to 39% after 6 months. But severe effects were still at 91% effective. So people were getting COVID, not getting sick. The Pfizer had their own study. Between 1 week and 2 months after the second dose, it was 96.2% effective. Between 2 and 4 months after the second dose, efficacy fell to 90.1%. From 4 to 6 months, the figure was 83.7%. However, against severe disease, the vaccine held steady at 97% effective. I should also say that if they actually approve this and America diverts tens of millions of vaccines to a third dose, which is obviously unnecessary, while almost none of Africa has a first dose, that will be really shit. So I hope they don't do that. Something I want to just talk about briefly, which I was actually on the drum this week. For those who aren't in Australia, the drum is one of the thousands of cheap panel shows in Australia on 24-hour news networks where they get people to come to for free and just blather. I was on there and I was talking about COVID in America, and there was a point I didn't get to make. I want to make it to you guys because I think it's worth making and most people don't make it. And that is, we hear all the time about the unknowns of COVID vaccines. That's something that the anti-vaxxers talk a lot about. They say, well, it hasn't even been approved officially. It's just an emergency approval at the moment. And who knows what's going to be like in 2 years' time or 3 years' time or 4 years' time. Who knows what effects there'll be? We don't know. It's unknown. Let's not take the chance, they say. Yeah, they're right. We don't know what's going to happen in 2 years' time. There is the world's biggest experiment taking place at the moment with hundreds of millions of people. And in fact, it's probably over 1 billion people by now. And for all we know, I mean, I don't think there's going to be any side effects because I would have expected they would have happened by now to millions of people. But let's say there is in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. We can't know that. That's true. I'll give them that. But you know what we never hear about? We never hear about the unknowns of COVID. I don't mean the unknowns of whether you're going to die or not. We know that most people aren't going to die unless they're old or unless they're immunocompromised. I'm talking about if you don't die, if you are just a little bit sick, you just have a flu. People just assume you're okay then. Or if you're asymptomatic, they just assume you're okay. But do we know that? No, there are unknowns there as well. I'll give you 2 examples. A lot of people have cardio issues, just minor cardio issues after they get COVID. Now, are they just temporary or are they going to bedevil those people for the rest of their lives? That's unknown. We don't know. Even more than that, there was a study recently of, I'm trying to remember what it was, I think it was Oxford. It was definitely English. I think it was Oxford. It was a study where they were following a group of people, a very large group of people, like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, for a long time. I'm doing this off the top of my head, that's why I don't have the numbers, I'm sorry. For a long time. And they followed them through getting COVID. And they ended up having, I don't know, 6,000 or 10,000, whatever. So a sizable number of people who got COVID. Most of them were asymptomatic or not very sick, obviously. But a very large number of those people lost grey matter, including the asymptomatic people. It actually didn't matter whether you got really sick or not. You lost your grey matter at about the same proportions. So that's a big unknown, isn't it? Are you going to get brain damage? Is it temporary or is it permanent? Does it make no difference or does it make a real difference? Does it lead to further degradation down the line? Are those people going to end up getting Alzheimer's earlier? We don't know. It's unknown. There are so many unknowns associated with getting COVID. So if you're going to talk about the unknowns of the vaccine, remember the unknowns of COVID. To me, they are much more likely and in much higher proportions and also much more worrying than the unknowns associated with the vaccine. So just consider that if you're on the fence a bit. And let's face it, if you're listening or watching this podcast, you're probably not on the fence. This is a very data-driven podcast. Anyway, but I just want to share that with you. That's an argument you can use with an anti-vaxxer if you come across one. I want to talk about something that, sorry, hello? 5? Okay, thank you. 5 minutes I'm going to talk the lab leak theory quickly. Now, let's be clear, there is some revisionism going on at the moment about lab leak. Fauci, for instance, was a great example. He said on CBS recently, people forget, but if you go back last year, even though you lean towards feeling this is more likely a natural occurrence, we always felt that you've got to keep an open mind, all of us. We didn't get up and start announcing it, but what we said, keep an open mind and continue to look. But in May 2020, he said in National Geographic, if you look at the evolution of the virus in bats and what's out there now, the scientific evidence is very, very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated. Everything about the stepwise evolution over time strongly indicates this virus evolved in nature and then jumped species. And the press definitely acted like it was, like natural transmission hypothesis was the only legit one. Facebook was, and YouTube were banning people who said otherwise, okay? So, and that is bullshit. I don't like YouTube banning people for stuff they can't prove is the case. And it was always speculation one way or another. But many real scientists were open-minded. They just got ignored, like scientists often do. It's the loud voices that people hear. And now there's obviously a lot of re-evaluation going on. Fair enough. And then that's because of a bunch of lefties and scientists have happened to talk about it. Not much has changed. The evidence hasn't changed that much. The evidence that they were talking about has been there for 6 months. But now it's getting paid attention to. Okay, so where are we about? Let's talk about lab leak. There are all kinds of theories out there about the genomic structure that suggests it did evolve naturally and that it didn't evolve naturally. There are credible people on both sides of that, so I'm not going to weigh into that. I'm not going to question either of their contributions. It's inconclusive though, so I'm just going to leave that for now. What's the evidence for the lab leak hypothesis? Okay, a lot of people have pointed out that there's no smoking gun virus that's been found in nature that's close enough to COVID to suggest a natural evolution. That's true. Note though, there was a study of 411 bat samples collected from a region in Yunnan province between May 2019 and November 2020. There were a lot of bats there and they identified 24 full-length coronavirus genomes, including 4 novel SARS-CoV-2 related ones. That's the COVID one. It's closer than we've found before, but still not close enough. Okay, so we haven't found one. And yes, there is circumstantial evidence. Lab mistakes happen all the time. There were 750 security compromises in 7 years in American labs, for instance. The original SARS virus actually leaked from the Chinese Institute of Virology in Beijing twice. Okay, so leaks do happen. Wuhan is over 1,000 miles from the cave that the virus supposedly came from. Okay, that's a long way. There were no infections along the way that we know of, so that's a bit sus as well. That's all circumstantial evidence. But the star evidence that people refer to is the lying that's going on from China and Chinese scientists and ridiculous security. Not just in labs, but in caves. They're stopping scientists sampling in the cave. You'd think the Chinese government wouldn't want to interfere with scientists trying to prove that the virus evolved naturally, but they are. So you can see why that's suspicious. They lie and they lie and they lie, and then they say the Wuhan lab should win the Nobel Prize, which is ridiculous. But, and I should say as well, there's a third theory that people don't talk about, which is it could be natural evolution from the lab, because they had animals in there. So maybe one of those animals had a virus that then spread around. We don't know that. That's just thrown out there. That's potential. But on the other hand, there's plenty. So that's what's weak about the natural evolution theory. But there's plenty weak with the lab leak theory as well that we never hear about. There are also no compounds close to COVID in the lab. You need to have a compound close enough to modify for it to be artificially made. You need to modify a compound. And we don't know of any compounds. We've discovered no compounds that are close enough to be modified to become COVID. So that hasn't been discovered either. That's equal to the natural evolution theory. And if we heard about the three scientists, people talk about, there's the three Chinese scientists who had COVID, or had the flu in November 2019 and went to hospital. If they had COVID and they went to hospital, why was there no outbreak then? The outbreak took months to go. We saw what happened in hospitals when COVID's around. Even when they're taking precautions, it spreads everywhere. They would have taken no precautions in November 2019, yet it didn't spread anywhere. Why not? That's sus. The last foreign scientist in Wuhan in December 2019, Danielle Anderson, she says she saw no one getting sick. She didn't get COVID, and China sent Wuhan scientists with her to Singapore for a conference after the initial issues. And that would be odd if they already had an outbreak going on at Wuhan. Part of the problem here is that there's, and I'm going to wrap this up because I've been given the hurry up. But essentially the problem is here, with the lab leak theory versus natural theories, there's two standards of proof that are going on in public. People are picking holes in the natural transmission hypothesis, but they're treating the lab leak as the only alternative. One shouldn't be treated as an alternative. They should be treated the same with the same levels of evidence. And neither of them are meeting that level of evidence at this point in time. And then another theory we should say is that I'll quote Alex Shepard, this was written quite well. The lab leak theory and its attendant controversies is especially difficult to cover at the moment because the people driving the discussion aren't sincerely interested in uncovering the origin of the virus. Instead, they're using the matter as a proxy for other unrelated concerns. For Trump, it was a way of excusing his own failures and confronting the pandemic. For Lindsey Graham, it's a way of raising the spectre of a corrupt press enthralled to Democrat pay. For many others, it's become a new way of raising wider concerns about political correctness and cancel culture. And obviously for China, they have their own motives as well. So they're all using it as a proxy. None of them care about the lab leak in particular. They're trying to fight other battles through lab leak versus natural theory, which makes it hard to trust people. I'm going to leave it there. All I would say is that I got a science degree. I've read a lot about this kind of stuff before. Not this one in particular, the COVID thing, obviously around COVID, but trying to prove natural evolution is extremely hard. It sometimes takes decades. They still don't know where AIDS came from. We're not going to know, even if China wasn't getting in the way, we're not going to know the truth about this for a long time if we're going to do it properly and we're going to actually follow the evidence. China is getting in the way. It might make it impossible to ever know. But just all I ask you is to keep an open mind and follow the evidence equally for both sides. Don't tilt the playing field depending on which side you prefer, which is what everyone is doing at the moment. And so, yeah, so that's the reason why I don't actually have a favourite horse in this theory, in this race. Just don't apply double standards, please. I would like to talk more about it, but I've been putting this off forever, and I've got to go. So that will do for now. I'll talk more about COVID another time. I missed out a couple of things. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in. We'll get through the longer podcast eventually when the lockdown is over. But until then, this is the best we can do. Thank you very, very much for indulging us, and I will see you next week. Bye.